our second guest of the day. I ran through that very fast. Sorry, guys, but I just wanted to give time to Malek. I will now hand over to my colleague, Stuart.
Thanks, Lynette. Our next guest is Malek Rifai, who is a senior associate in real estate at Tamimi company. Malek advises in all aspects of commercial real estate transactions, including the acquisition and disposal of direct and indirect real estate investments, development of large-scale real estate projects, commercial lettings, and real estate financing. He has a particular expertise in advising on the structuring and setting up and registration of regulated real estate funds. Malek, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Stuart. It's a pleasure to be here.
Sorry, go on.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I'm going to hand over to you for your presentation.
Perfect. So I will start first with the global landscape and with what we are seeing around the world. So next slide, please. Yeah. So basically, this is what Nassim Taleb called a Black Swan event in terms of this is unprecedented. This is essentially a healthcare crisis that obviously resulted in an economic crisis, which we are seeing now in terms of GDP contractions around the world. It could potentially lead to a financial crisis. And there's a lot of talk about how the recovery will be in terms of whether it will be a V-shaped recovery or U-shaped recovery. I will leave this to the finance experts to decide on and predict. But government's response, if we look at it generally, it's basically there's a lack of globally coordinated effort. So governments are in a firefighting mode, and they are focused on each country by itself on their own needs. Now, one thing for sure, and this is a common trait among all governments, is that they're not shying away from the use of stimulus packages. So, and the purpose is of course to inject liquidity into the market, and this is the biggest concern for governments at the moment. So, if you look at the U.S. stimulus package, for example, it's nearing $3 trillion. Just to put things into perspective, this is 3 times what has been deployed in the financial crisis, and this amounts to almost 13% of the U.S. 2019 GDP. And this is not the most aggressive one. Japan, for example, is at 21% of its 2019 GDP in terms of stimulus packages. So you can see that there's a lot of will to inject liquidity in the markets. Next slide, please. So how is the real estate landscape looking globally? The entire value chain is certainly affected. Capital markets, developers, asset operators, primary and secondary market sales. So it's across the board. But one thing for sure is that not all assets have been affected equally. The general criteria in terms of deciding or predicting how a real estate asset would be affected is usually the human density element. So the more you have a human density in a real estate asset, the more it will be affected. Shopping malls, university, healthcare facilities, labor accommodation, and so forth. This, for example, this category is more affected than self-storage, industrial warehouses, data centers, and non-core assets. In the retail segment, if we look at retail, for example, not all retail has been also affected equally. You have the essential retail, which is pharmacies, grocery stores, supermarkets. These have been doing a good performance recently, and non-essential retail, of course, has been hit hard. Commercial offices, to a certain extent, are more resistant due to the fact that they could still be operated, be that at lesser capacity, whether it's 30% or 50%. Having said that, there are commercial offices that are more affected than others because they relate to companies that are themselves operating in sensitive sectors that are affected. So, for example, a company that works in airline or works in hospitality sector or in the travel sector. So we need to be aware of this distinction also among the commercial offices space. With respect to hospitality assets, many operators have, and this is what we're seeing recently, many operators have chosen to close their hotels. And this is because simply operating them under the current circumstances is no longer commercially feasible. So many operators have chosen to close their hotels, and a lot of them on a permanent basis. Residential assets are also more resistant. We could see a lower demand due to redundancies and lower spending power, but this should not be significant in my opinion. Next slide, please. So what has been done in terms of the UAE? The UAE Central Bank has doubled the stimulus package. It's now almost around $70 billion to support the economy. Most of the new measures are focused on easing financial and liquidity requirements for banks to free up cash for lending. Banks have been also directed to use the funding for temporary relief and to provide 6 months relief to corporate and retail clients. There is also practical challenges in terms of SMEs because banks are still required to conduct due diligence and because there's also a higher risk of insolvency. So there are practical challenges in terms of getting this liquidity across to the consumers. We are seeing an increase in LTV ratios. I think Brendan will address that in more detail, but basically the LTV ratios have been increased by 5% for first-time expats, depending on, of course, whether it's the value of the property is more than 5 million or 10 million. Same for first-time Emirati buyers. Now, there is also an increase in the maximum exposure that banks can have to the real estate sector, and this is very important. So banks now can have a maximum exposure of 30%, provided that they hold additional capital. Banks are also directed to open bank accounts for SMEs within 2 days, provided that all documentation is there. We know that there are also specific sector-specific measures that are being taken by the government, and we're expecting more initiatives to come as the situation develops. Next slide, please. In terms of real estate, direct and related measures, first we have, this is the most important one, the Dubai Judicial Council. Currently, a temporary suspension until further notice on all eviction judgments related to residential and commercial facilities in Dubai is in place. And this is very important in terms of eviction judgments. There's also a suspension of all imprisonment judgments linked to rental disputes. And this could bring comfort to tenants who are currently under pressure. Next slide, please. In terms of the Dubai government's efforts, they have announced the dirham 1.5 billion economic stimulus package, which is intended to support the companies and the business sector in Dubai. Commercial licenses can be renewed without the need for a lease agreement. Reduction of municipality fees on hotels from 7% to 3.5%. The fees for hotel ratings have been freezed. There's also, and this has been addressed by HIBA, which is the remote registration for transfer of properties. And this is a very good initiative and it's welcomed. We have tested it in Tamimi and it's working. Of course, nothing is perfect, and these initiatives are here to address the current situation, and they need improvement, and we expect improvement to be implemented going forward. RERA has also directed building management companies to consider additional measures, including cancellation of fines for 2019 and 2020, provision of flexible installments to pay for the service fees, reduction of service costs, and flexible payment options for air conditioning services and so forth. Next slide, please. On the free zone front, we have the Dubai Free Zones Council's decision, which is basically, it's an economic stimulus package that includes postponement of rent payments by a period of 6 months, refund of security deposits and guarantees, facilitating payments by way of installments, cancellation of fines on corporates and individuals. These actions apply generally to a number of free zones, including the IFC, JAFSA, DAFSA, and the SOA. Next slide, please. If we look at the DIFC, for example, which is the most notable one, the IFC has announced a free base rent for retail tenants from April to June 2020 in the IFC owned locations. So this means Gate Avenue, Gate Village, and Gate District. There's also a deferred payment plan that is offered to tenants with respect to all properties owned by the IFC investments for a period of up to 6 months. Property transfer fees have been reduced from 5% to 4% for any sale of property that took place between April to June 2020, and if the transfer is registered with the DIFC registrar within 30 days after the expiry of the said 3 months period. There's a number of actions taken by each free zone. We're not going to get into that detail now. So next slide, please. What are we seeing in terms of immediate real estate trends? Rent relief and rent deferment are the words of the day. All the clients are asking about these. We have witnessed an unprecedented increase in terms of queries related to force majeure, possibility of rent relief, decrease, termination of leases, and what have you. The courts have not settled the position on force majeure, so there's a little clarity around how the courts will apply the force majeure. We are seeing key mall operators that have a more resilient balance sheet, allowing them to take a long-term view on the situation, whereas small operators and single asset operators do not have a strong balance sheet usually, and they don't have the luxury of taking a very long-term view approach. There's also an increase in demand for warehouse space, which is substantially due to the increase in e-commerce activity and the search for grade A assets. We are seeing also a large number of inquiries in relation to property funds, including REITs, of course, and similar investment funds. This is particularly from institutional clients who are looking into discounted and distressed assets. With respect to residential properties, as the figures are showing, there's an increase in demand for outdoor spaces, villas, townhouse, gated communities, and so forth. Next slide, please. So what should we do in terms of, we've seen these trends, what should key real estate players anticipate going forward? We believe that they need to strategically review their goals and processes. This is because they need to adapt to the new requirements, whether in relation to the usage of the real estate or the other market requirements currently in force. So for example, you have digital transformation was always on the agenda of real estate players. Now it has been pushed on top of the agenda. And by real estate players, I mean all stakeholders, including DLD, including brokers, including banks. So digital transformation is, of course, a top item agenda. We expect employers to cut down on non-essential travels. This means that there would be a drive down. There would be a lower demand within the business-focused segment of the hospitality sector. We expect changes in the requirement for office space. So potentially new regulations could come into force in terms of construction, more employers seeking flexi desks, focuses on meeting space rather than individual offices. Hotel operators will have to focus definitely on domestic demand, especially in light of the current travel restrictions to have a better performance. For home living, there's a greater need to ensure a work-friendly environment and more demand for homes with outdoor areas, such as villas and townhouses. There is obviously an oversupply of retail assets in Dubai markets, so the developers and sellers need to, and operators of assets need to rethink the usage of these assets and whether they can be repurposed for other uses to adapt to the market needs. Thank you very much, Stuart.
Thank you, Malek. That's a great presentation and some really in-depth information there to share with our audience today. We already have some questions for you, so I'm going to start with them if that's okay.
Absolutely.
The first question is, what advice would you have for tenants who wish to engage in negotiations for rent reductions or waivers in light of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, I think that tenants need to be aware that there's no one-size-fits-all solution to their problems. So they need to accurately assess the situation. It might sound obvious, but they need to have a deeper look at their lease agreements and lease provisions. They also need to have a good understanding of how the civil code provisions operate, because some of them override what could be agreed in terms of lease documentation. Try as much as possible to negotiate with the landlords. Trust me, I'm a lawyer. It's better to have a bad settlement than a good lawsuit. So negotiation is key. Many landlords do not wish to evict their tenants because they will face challenges in terms of getting new tenants. Also keep an eye on the latest legislations, because the situation is very dynamic and new legislations could be implemented that could affect them.
Great, thank you. Next question is, what have been the key trends you've seen in terms of the demands from clients wishing to complete transactions during the COVID-19 pandemic?
Good question, Stuart. We have two types of trends. We have first the clients who have signed SPAs prior to COVID-19, and sorry, not tenants, I mean sellers and purchasers. And these ones, they have the biggest concern that they had was with in relation to the completion of their transaction and closing this transaction, and whether they could rely on the force majeure provisions. The other trend that we're seeing now with sale and purchase agreements is basically our clients want the agreements to be more COVID proof, and they are aware that they might face challenges in terms of closing the transaction, and they want the provisions in the relevant agreements to address this probability. So yeah, these are the main two trends.
Great, thank you. Next question is, what advice would you have for those who are thinking about acquiring distressed assets?
Look, it's basically having a good price or getting an asset at a discounted price is definitely a good thing, but it should not dispense with the requirement to conduct a legal due diligence. Sometimes the asset is cheap because there's a big reason for it to be cheap. So I would say engage with your legal advisors, retain lawyers. I know that sometimes you're gonna be paying good amounts, but on the long term, it will help you in terms of knowing the risks that are associated with real estate assets, especially on the commercial side.
Okay, so due diligence is absolutely vital then in that kind of situation.
It's really vital, because many times, many of our clients are coming to us with distressed assets, and basically we find out during the due diligence that these assets bear significant risks on the clients.
Okay, thank you. Next question is, what do you think will be the key factor that will determine the success of individuals and companies alike in the real estate sector following the pandemic?
Very good question. Clients currently are in a firefighting mode. They're trying to deal with issues as they arise. But I think clients who are likely to succeed, they could be the ones who are taking a deep look into their operation and revising their operation based on the new requirements of the market. The companies that would struggle are the ones that are not agile enough to adapt and which are still attached to legacy strategies, if you want.
Yeah, okay. And final question is, there's obviously a lot of doom and gloom at the moment in the market and a lot of uncertainty. Do you have any reason to be optimistic going forward?
Absolutely, absolutely, Stuart. The crisis is not specific to Dubai. That's a good thing. It has affected all countries equally. So all things being equal, Dubai still has strong fundamentals. And we need to always keep in mind, real estate is a cyclical business. So things should perform in the future. Dubai still has strong fundamentals. It's still an international hub, excellent infrastructure, grade A assets across the board, whether it's in retail, commercial offices, or industrial assets. So there's really no reason to worry in terms of what would the future hold.
I completely agree with you, actually. So second everything you just said. That's great to hear, Malek.
Next question is to Malek. Will the UAE government open mortgages to international buyers that are not residents to the UAE?
Well, to be honest with you, Lynette, I don't have any good answer for that. I think there should be a move towards that, but I am not aware of any measure taken now.
All right, next one is to Malek. Is it possible to cancel a closed deal with a down payment of 30%, considering the SPA has not yet been signed and only the reservation form was signed?
Well, it certainly depends on what the reservation form mentions. Now, if you don't have an SPA, theoretically speaking, you don't have a definitive agreement and you don't have a definitive commitment in the transaction. But it is possible that the reservation form contains a certain level of commitment. So I think it needs to be reviewed on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, thank you. Next one is for you again, Malek. All the commercial and residential tenants are asking for reductions or waive off of current period rent. Are there any circulars or instructions from the government for rent reductions or waive offs?
Well, yeah, as I said in the presentation, it depends on where your premises are located and what type of rent measures have been taken. So, for example, in the IFC, for retail clients, there has been rent reductions. So it all depends on the location of the asset and which and what kind of measures have been taken. Generally speaking, if you're on Dubai onshore, there are no measures. There's no specific regulation saying basically that there's no legislation giving rent waiver or rent reduction. So for free zones, this is more a scenario with free zones rather than onshore assets. Generally, you have also the civil code provisions, and tenants need to be aware that there are certain provisions in the civil code that they could rely on in terms of getting rent reductions and potentially waivers.
Sorry, Malek, I didn't mean to interrupt. Please go ahead.
No, please.
I just wanted to add, just from my recent discussion with, judges at RDC, like you said, there's no clear direction in terms of this is how much we're going to reduce. But, they did say we are very keen, and they wanted me to spread the message today saying we're so keen on trying to find a solution that's mutually beneficial for both parties. So considering reduction in rents or even a waiver of rent for that month of service where you couldn't really do business is their top priority. Because when you reach the last resort, which is termination or early termination of rent, this is in nobody's best interest. When you terminate a contract, it's not serving the interest of the landlord or the tenant, right? So that's really the last resort that they're trying to avoid. And of course, like I said, with a distinction between residential and commercial.
And Hiba, also, sorry, to your point, and I totally agree with you. And obviously, the Rental Dispute Settlement Center has taken this this measure, and we can see it through one of actually the precedent judgments that have been issued by the Rental Dispute Settlement Center, where they've allowed an employee that was unable to basically who was made redundant, they allowed him to terminate his lease. So it goes to show that the Rental Dispute Settlement Center is looking at tenancies on a case-by-case basis and to see whether the argument has merits or not. Yes.